Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Bryce Duskett and thank you for joining us today on Market Journal. A winter wheat harvest is underway here in Nebraska. As we start today's show, I wanted to share with you some of these photos we received from farmers across Nebraska as they make their way through their winter wheat fields. As of July 10th, USDA is estimating that 36% of the Nebraska winter wheat had been harvested. Coming up next week on the show, we'll check in on harvest progress and hear from a producer on how his crops are yielding thus far. As we kick things off with today's show, at the end of June, Nebraska Extension hosted their annual Weed Management Field Day at the South Central Ag Lab, which is located just east of Hastings. This event gives producers the opportunity to view demonstrations of weed control systems in corn, sorghum, and soybeans. We can all admit that the daily ins and outs of crop production can seem repetitive at times. However, in the agricultural practice, there's always something new to learn, and field days like this are one of the best ways that producers can stay up to date with the latest research information.
Oh, well, the thing in agriculture is there's always something new, but there's always something old that comes back and looks like the new. When we think of these ag laboratories like this, one of the big functions is to try new things and take the risks so our producers don't have to. I mean, that's what we're in this for, is to find new discoveries, field test them, see what works, what doesn't work, and then give out that factual information to our growers. Some of the highlights are the new modes of action. I shouldn't say new modes of action, but the new chemicals that are coming down the line, the new combinations, and also the systems approach. You know, it's just not relying on one molecule, but how do we systems approach? Can we use cover crops? Can we graze? How do we get it to germinate? And, you know, more of a holistic, we're in this for the long haul.
While this field day highlighted some of the new chemical options for weed control, the big take-home message wasn't necessarily the focus on weed control for current production season. Rather, educators were insistent that producers take an approach to weed control that looks well into the future for their operation.
We included a number of projects that basically discusses the chemical and non-chemical control methods for management of herbicide-resistant weeds in corn and soybean particularly. Absolutely, it is very important because number of weeds can survive like 5 to 6 years in the soil, and whenever there is a good opportunity, they will emerge. So that's why if we think about only 1 year, then maybe we are adding too much in the soil seed bank from the weed seed bank perspective. So that's why now our message to growers is like not only think about weed control in this year, but you also need to make like a 5-year program, which program can reduce the overall seed production from weed species. Particularly, I would watch for water hemp and palmer amaranth. They both are widespread. They both have evolved resistance to number of herbicides. So the greatest approach will be we may need to reduce the overall seed production from those weed species, and then eventually we will get good control by adopting chemical and non-chemical weed control methods.
Much of the information shared at this field day will be available online, but you may find that your experience would be more immersive if you were to attend one of these events in person.
The great thing about this type of field day is it's like a demonstration based, so you will actually see the results of our treatments in front of you under the natural growing conditions. So we always provide good information by using presentations during our winter annual meetings like crop production clinics, but in my opinion, this is even better because you can see the results of the treatments, you can ask questions to a number of speakers, and you will have answer right away.
If you would like to attend any field days this summer, there are still several opportunities available to you. Coming up next week on July 19th, it is the 4Rs Field Day. This educational opportunity will take producers through nutrient stewardship and knowledge and tools to help improve soil health, crop yields, water quality, and overall profit. Coming up August 4th, the South Central Ag Lab will be hosting another field day that will cover topics such as nutrient management, soil health, disease, insect management, and much more. We posted additional information about these events along with this story on the Market Journal website. Up next, livestock feed is usually one of the greatest costs that a livestock producer faces. That makes grassland management a key component of ensuring profitability. Market Journal's Bill Dodd recently spoke with a Nebraska Extension beef systems educator to get his take on the necessity of plant identification when dealing with grassland management.
Managing grassland profitably will inevitably require the ability to identify what plants are in your pastures, as well as understanding the important characteristics of core desirable plants and common or problematic undesirable plants. However, this doesn't necessarily mean that you need the ability to identify every single plant that you survey.
I suggest starting with the top 5 most common or most undesirable species, desirable or undesirable. And I think even before this, it comes down to a fundamental understanding of the plant community. And so whether that is, cool season base, a warm season base, or a mix of both, and then starting out kind of looking at what the most important species are. And I think ranchers for the most part will understand what these species are, but kind of starting with those core species. I like to think of them as, group them into desirable and undesirable. So you can pay attention to really what you want and what you're managing for, and then keep an eye on those potential invasive species that might be creeping in as well. So desirable and undesirable plants will depend heavily on first the goals of the property or the operation, and then also on the location, which will dictate precipitation and soil type. And so, for example, in eastern Nebraska, smooth brome grass might be a desirable species for a livestock producer because of the forage quality and quantity produced. However, if the goal of the operation is more focused on wildlife, then smooth brome grass would be an undesirable species because it creates such a monoculture, and instead of the variability of species and habitat structure that are desired by wildlife. In the sandhills, prairie sandreed and sand bluestem would be staple species for a cattle diet. As you move further west, you move into more of a cool season dominated pastures with a lot of western wheatgrass, or even a shortgrass prairie component, which can have cool and warm season species. And so it varies a lot across the state of Nebraska in particular, but depends on the region, and then depends on the goals of the operation primarily.
Not all agricultural operations are the same, so it stands to reason that some plants may be more desirable or undesirable to a producer, depending on the function of the plants within their respective operation.
Yeah, so livestock production producers, it'll even depend on what type of production and what species. And so if you're running cattle, which is common around here and in Nebraska, then you'd be looking at more of a species that produces you want good quality, because whether you have a cow-calf operation or a stock or yearling operation, or both, you're going to want to have some good quality species out there, so good high-end protein and energy, and be able to grow those calves or those yearlings, and be able to meet the nutrient requirements of the cows that are producing milk for their calves. There's also a lot of conservation-minded ranchers, and so they're looking at wildlife as well, and they're looking at potential hunting enterprises or wildlife viewing enterprises, and so that's becoming more and more popular. Ecotourism, and then we also have organizations across the state, whether private or non-government organizations, or state organizations that manage property for wildlife, and so they'd be looking at maybe slightly different goals as far as versus livestock production.
While plant identification is a big part of managing your grassland, during the summer months, as the heat continues to climb, there are a few things you may want to consider when it comes to managing your pastures efficiently throughout an impending drought.
We're watching that really closely here in western Nebraska, because our pastures are cool season dominated, and when it starts to get hot and dry, they start to go dormant and put a seed head on, and quality decreases. And so that's something we're watching closely out here. It's basically comes down to keeping an eye on your forage resource, because impacts this year during a drought year are compounded. So if we're in there and we're grazing a little heavier than we should, or we're not watching the pastures and we stay in a pasture a little longer than we should, those impacts are going to be compounded, and we're going to feel those effects for potentially not even just next year, but several years to come. And so I would urge folks to watch their forage supply in the pasture closely and how those plants are responding or not responding when it comes to grazing and the dryness. And then keep an eye on your animals, of course, their demand to make sure you're still meeting their nutrient requirements, and keep an eye on what plants they're selecting for. And if their diet is starting to if their condition's starting to slip and they're starting to select for less desirable, less nutritious species, then it's time potentially to move those animals to a different pasture or think about other grazing mitigation. So looking at destocking or feeding or something like that.
While identifying every plant in your pasture isn't necessarily something you must be able to do, if you can identify the most desirable plants and nurture them along, while also identifying the most undesirable plants in order to mitigate their presence, you're well on your way to managing your grasslands more profitably. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Jack also tells us while plant identification can seem like a daunting task, it is a valuable skill to have available in your toolbox. Once you're able to identify a few plants, identifying others will become easier with practice. If you'd like to learn more about plant ID in your grasslands, we've included an article by Jack on this subject to the Market Journal website. As we shift our focus over to the grain markets now, it's been a roller coaster start to the month of July. On Wednesday, the latest consumer inflation data was released. The CPI rose 9.1% from a year ago. Add to that weather concerns trying to drive prices higher for row crops. To catch up on all the latest impact of the grain trade, we caught up with Doug Simon on Wednesday afternoon from Tredas.
It's not been much fun if you're a producer and looking at the selling prices, but we have seen a big drop in oil too. We had 8% drop on Tuesday this week, and oil went back below 100 down to 95. So highs were around 130, when we had the invasion of Ukraine. So we've had a lot of inflation in a lot of the commodities, but this last couple weeks have been really devastating as they push a lot of that premium of the war in Ukraine out of the market.
Well, it seems like there's been a lot of different justification for some of the movement we've seen in the row crop commodities. We can dive deeper into some of those here, but big picture, what are two of the three of the most important ones that are driving things right now?
I think the biggest thing really is oil price when you look at that, and interest rates. Basically the Fed has increased interest rates to dampen inflation. And so that's really had an impact on a lot of different commodities. If you look at milk, it's down 15%. Copper's gone from 5 down to, toward 3. Lumber's gone from $1,500 down to $500. So some of those other commodities have been over a longer time, but we're seeing that more, impact the corn and the beans now as we've kind of got, as we've gone into the growing season, got the crops established, even though they've had a lot of hail and wind and we're dry, but we still got fundamental questions there. But it's really been a week of fun selling right now.
Well, you referenced inflation. We had the latest data come out on Wednesday. The consumer inflation data, CPI, rose 9.1% from year ago levels. What does that tell you about what we could see in the commodities?
Well, it's all a reflection of what's going on in gas and diesel and the oil prices, and then it's also labor shortages. So you've got the cost push of the energies in there, but also we don't have the labor supply. So all those things add together, which is, so by cutting, or by increasing the interest rates, they're basically hoping to cool off demand.
We had a WASDE report come out on Tuesday. Anything interesting from that strike you?
It was pretty quiet. Like the last time I was here, it was pretty quiet. And I said the bigger deal is going to be how does weather treat our yields? And that's still true. There wasn't anything terribly surprising. We had basically less soybean acres, which was shown to us in the June 30th report. The stocks were up a little bit on corn. Those basically went into the balance sheets. And the big deal is too, though, is if we lose a couple bushels of yield on soybeans or corn for that matter, it really tightens up our bean balance sheet, which we'll know more about production come August. Right now, I think people are asking, well, we're like 2012. We're not that hot, we're not that dry. Maybe we were more like a 2010 or 11. Those years we did see reduced yield from the heat. If you look at Elwyn Taylor's old stress degree days, actually Purdue keeps track of that now, and we are definitely below normal on that, or the stress is actually higher than normal. We've had less rain, more heat, and it's definitely, so we'll see here. The forecasts haven't really changed. We're still warm and dry. There's some rains that can come through here, but are they widespread? No. So still concerned, still on, I think there's real important, weather trends over the next 2 weeks can impact yield on corn pretty dramatically as we go through pollination, and demand for moisture really goes up.
Doug, as you know, here on Market Journal, we like to solicit our viewers to see what's on their minds and ask them what kind of questions they'd ask you. I've got a couple of them I want to get to. Make sure I get in Daryl's question from Southwest Nebraska. He's curious about the funds leaving the market, asking you, are they staying in the commodities, or what's your outlook for the funds?
Well, they built a lot of length as we went from a really bearish market 2 years ago, and they've really they've hit about half of what they owned in corn and beans. They've taken wheat back to more neutral, but they're still long 150,000 contracts of corn. So I don't really see them going negative or selling and going on the kind of short, but they could come back toward neutral pretty easily in the ags. But really, I still think the inflation scenario is still in play, and oil still. There's enough production issues there in the world that I don't see us completely collapsing the economy, the commodities and the economy right now.
Well, Doug, before we wrap up here, I always want to get your thoughts on risk management advice you're offering right now. What can producers do to lock in some profit out there right now?
Well, we're always looking at increments in the seasonal time frame, and the seasonals are pretty negative from this time going into the fall, or in beans more specifically to August. But we always like to sell increments over time. One of the questions you asked me earlier is, what's a put? And you can use put options underneath there and say, hey, if I want to try to protect this floor and spend a little bit of money. The opposite of that is like if I want to try to buy a call and try to be able to participate in the upside market. An example I gave you is, what if you wanted to buy farm ground at $5,000 an acre, but now it's gone to $10,000? Well, that call would have given you an opportunity, but not the obligation to buy it at $5,000 an acre. But if it goes to 10, it's like, hey, I've got a $5,000 gain in my call, and I want to take advantage of that. So just the converse of that is a put, where I want to put grain to the market, and we use that, to protect our selling price of corn. So you can use those things. When people say, I don't want to spend that much, I want to keep that money in my own pocket, so they'll do either a futures position or a hedge derived to just lock in those positions. But I think you have to look at what you're going to raise and what your crop insurance values are and sell increments. That comes from Bob Wisner over at Iowa State University and a lot of his seasonal theories of selling corn, and I'd like to use that idea. I think that serves us well over time. It's just kind of the opposite of dollar cost averaging that people use on stock allocations. You want to allocate your crop over time as we know more about it.
Thanks to Doug for his time this week. Now, coming up next week, we'll be joined by author and analyst Elaine Cubb. If you have a question you'd like for me to ask Elaine, email us or get in touch on social media, and I'll be sure to pass your question along. Up next, hail has certainly been a real problem across the grain-producing regions of Nebraska, spanning from the east all the way to the west this year. Handling hail can be a difficult task because you're not always sure if you should replant, wait and see, plant cover crops, or see if the crop will turn out just fine. Justin McMecken, Nebraska Extension Cropping Protection and Cropping System Specialist, has researched hail damage on crops, and he shares his insights in the July issue of the Nebraska Farmer. Well, it is now time for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Well, Al, I know you're not planning on your regular forecast this week. What do you have in store for our viewers at home?
Well, Bryce, I had to make a quick trip to Michigan to take care of some family business, and unfortunately I'm not here for the weekly forecast, so I thought this was our perfect opportunity to give you an update of where our soil moisture and our precipitation status is since last fall, what we have in store for heat maybe possibly coming over these next 2 weeks, and then a quick look at maybe some of the conditions that might develop between the late summer into the fall period that may impact both grain fill and, of course, the early harvest period. So the first graphic I want to show you is what's happened over the last 30 days, and this is important from a standpoint that we've seen a large portion of the southwestern part of the state, portions of north central and northeast Nebraska, moving down into portions of east central Nebraska that, even with the recent precipitation events, still has shown a fairly significant deficit, anywhere from 1.5 to 2 inches in these areas. We do have an above normal precipitation anomalies in the Panhandle, portions of the southern Sandhills and southeastern Sandhills, and then along the Kansas-Nebraska border, essentially from about Red Cloud all the way over to Fall City. If we look even farther back, and this takes us all the way back through last fall, which is the beginning of our soil moisture recharge period, and then through presently where we're at in terms of the crop season, we have deficits anywhere from 6 to upwards of 10 inches, and the 8 to 10 inch range is in these darker colors. These are the areas that are going to be most susceptible to seeing significant crop damage due to the heat and lack of precipitation that looks like it's going to occur over the next 2 weeks. And we may start to see some of that impact spread significantly into the center part of the state. More importantly, areas to the southeast and to the northwest, if we go 2 weeks without any major precipitation, we're most likely going to see these areas at least go into abnormally dry status in the southeast and probably up 1 drought level into the northwest. More importantly, if we look at just a flash glance at what the upper air models are showing as we tape this, basically the ridge is going to reestablish itself as we go into the early part of the week, and it's going to build into the center part of the country. At the same time, this trough is going to try to work across the northern plains and flatten that ridge out, and that doesn't look like it's going to occur until the midweek period. And then as we go into next Saturday, the ridge starts to reestablish itself as that trough moves over to the Great Lakes. A little bit of energy runs along the periphery of this ridge, which may clip the northern part of the state, but there's no overwhelming evidence of widespread precipitation. This is going to be more isolated and concentrated in small little areas. So hopefully that we'll get the major precipitation when it does occur so that we can offset some of this heat and dryness that we're expecting to see. But more importantly, as we go toward the end of the month, and this is around the 28th, that high pressure system is from all the way from the central plains and is projected to be all the way back toward the west coast with the main storm track north of us. We'll watch these pieces of energy moving in the northern stream. If they start to carve off a trough, that will push that ridge even farther back. And the deeper this trough is, of course, the cooler the conditions will be in eastern Nebraska. And that will be the setup for where we would see northwest flow aloft. But bottom line, it doesn't look very promising for major precipitation over the next 2 weeks. More importantly, as we go into the fall period, looking at sea surface temperatures, La Nina conditions are predicted by CPC to reestablish themselves this fall. We have seen this area in the eastern equatorial Pacific to the central equatorial Pacific warm up dramatically, as is the Gulf of Alaska. So if we see the cold pool reestablish itself, that would be supportive of bringing colder water into the central Pacific and also would reestablish La Nina conditions. If this continues, this process with this warm water continue to build toward east, then we'd be looking at El Nino conditions. So La Nina, we'd have a dry fall harvest in the northern plains. La Nina, or El Nino, we'd have a wetter harvest in the southern plains. Stay tuned. We'll see what happens over the next 2 months.
Thank you for that information, Al. Well, we've shared photos from hail earlier this growing season that certainly caused headaches for crop producers throughout the state. Some had total loss on their fields due to severe weather, while others were spared from that reality. Damaging hail is often followed by crop disease for the plants that made it through the storm. Market Journal's Mike Straub recently had the opportunity to sit down with Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems to get an update on some crop diseases that corn producers should be on the lookout for.
So you can see the majority of the lesions are bacterial leaf streak.
Several bacterial diseases in corn caused by early season hail and wind damage have been confirmed in fields across the state. Producers who experience damage to their fields should be assessing their crops for the severity of these diseases and the need for treatment.
Some of the diseases that we're starting to see develop in some of this corn that's been impacted by the severe weather. As many people are aware, the wounding created by hail and high winds and sandblasting, or really anything, creates opportunities for a lot of our common pathogens to infect these plants, and then we see disease development subsequently after that. And so after some of the more recent severe hail that we've seen in that surviving corn, we are beginning to see some disease development. So I want to let you know what to look for and what's already showing up out there. Some of the most common diseases that you might see after hail events are often caused by bacteria. And common diseases like Goss's bacterial wilt and blight are beginning to show up. We're also seeing other diseases too, though, even bacterial stalk rot or top rot. And so we're seeing that, and some other things that you might see as the season progresses is the development of more common smut than what we routinely see in the state. Now, these pathogens in particular that I'm discussing are ones that don't necessarily, that can't be controlled with a foliar fungicide application. They're either bacterial or the fungi that cause them aren't managed by fungicides. And so for those reasons, we haven't recommended widespread fungicide applications because of the hail. So here are some things that you can look for. And so if you start seeing lesion development and discolorations, especially on some of these wounded leaves, things like water soaking, it looks like dark discoloration or even freckling on the leaves, that could very well develop into Goss's wilt, and those lesions can become very large. If you look closely at them on the top or especially on the bottom side, they may look really shiny as well, and so that's another clue that it's bacterial. In addition, though, some of these plants that may have been impacted by hail very early on when they were seedlings can become systemically infected with Goss's wilt. Those plants may often die before they ever reach maturity. And so look at those closely, and you can tell it apart from bacterial stalk rot, because bacterial stalk rot tends to smell really bad. And so as you're examining those plants, that's a quick way to tell it apart. And so as you're out in the field, be sure and take a look at all of those. Those diseases are ones we're going to see in these fields impacted by wounding. There are other diseases that are developing in addition to that. We're seeing our normal gray leaf spot, for example. We're also seeing some bacterial leaf streak, and we see some of that after hail, but it doesn't need a wound necessarily to infect, and so you'll see some of that in these fields as well. Some of the other diseases that you might see, especially if the severe weather persists later into the season, might be different from what we're seeing now. So as the season goes on and we move into the reproductive stages of corn, if you have wounding of the stalks, that could potentially lead to some stalk rot diseases later on. Or if you have wounding of the ears, of course, that can have a big impact on grain quality and the ear rot disease development there as well. And so the timing of when those wounding events occur really determines what the problems are that we might see later on.
If your crops experience damage due to hail or wind, it's a good idea to be monitoring your fields for risk later in the season. Warm temperatures, rainfall, and wind can increase the chance for spread or further development of these diseases. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Mike Straub.
Thank you for that story, Mike. If you'd like to catch up on the latest crop disease issues, you can find more information at cropwatch.unl.edu. We've also posted an informative article by Tamra on this subject at the Market Journal website. Well, that is going to do it for this week's show. As you've heard, Market Journal is online and on the same platforms that you use. Be sure that you followed our Instagram account for behind-the-scenes clips of the show. Just look us up by searching Market Journal. Until next time, I'm Bryce Duskett, wishing you a safe and productive week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.